I'd like to introduce to you Dr. Tamara Tribitt. She is a faculty member at Redlands University. She is in charge of the school counseling program. We're very fortunate to have her with us today.
Thanks, Carol. I wanted to start our discussion by highlighting the importance of triadic supervision and group supervision. The time commitment is a lot different versus individual, and so we can save time. But while it is a time saver, there are very important aspects of it. Intentionality becomes very important when you're deciding between triadic and group supervision versus individual. And then one of the major advantages for the supervisees is that they get exposed to a lot of different ways of approaching one problem or one situation. And so it kind of helps their lens broaden a little bit as far as what could possibly be done in their clinical work.
That's so helpful. So we're so fortunate to have our two participants today to be interviewed. Would you give us a brief description of each?
The person that we have talking to us about triadic supervision is Dr. David Kleist. He is the department chair in the Department of Counseling at Idaho State University. He is actually my professor. He's going to be talking to us specifically about the reflective model of triadic supervision, giving us a description of the processes and what that looks like. And then the second person we have is Dr. DiAnne Borders, and she is in the Department of Counseling and Educational Development in the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and much of her professional career has focused on supervision. She has written the new Handbook of Counseling Supervision, among a plethora of other publications surrounding supervision. It was such an honor to have the two of them with us. Thank you so much for being with us today. We appreciate you serving as our expert for the triadic supervision. And I was wondering if you could start off by helping us understand your background with triadic supervision and your experiences with it.
My background is couple and family counseling, and I actually find one-on-one work rather unstimulating. So when counseling's accrediting body, KCREP, allowed triadic supervision to be used in lieu of individual supervision, and a number of states since that time have gone to allow triadic supervision to be used in lieu of individual supervision also. I went to the literature on triadic supervision and found a reference from 1976 that basically defined triadic supervision as three people, a supervisor and two supervisees, but it didn't necessarily provide a description of the process of delivering triadic supervision. So I developed a model of triadic supervision that was based on Tom Anderson's work with reflecting teams and reflecting processes. Over the years since I started doing that back in roughly 2001, 2003, when it actually was implemented, there have been a few other triadic models that have found their way into the counseling literature. Gerard Lawson, with a doctoral student, created a model of triadic supervision, actually two forms. There's one model that they defined as single focus, meaning that there would be one supervisor and two supervisees, but in a given supervisory session, in that single focus, one supervisor had the whole time to talk about a case or cases, show videotape, etc. And then the supervisor and the observing supervisee would give feedback, kind of wearing a consultation hat, if you want to think of the Bernard and Goodyear model, the discrimination model. They also put forth a split focus, where instead of having one supervisee have the entire session with them as the focus, they decided to take a supervisory meeting and split it in half. Where in the first half, the supervisor one would show a tape, talk about their concerns. The supervisor and the other student would act as co-supervisors, I suppose would be one way to look at it. And then they would, shift the focus to the other supervisor during the second half.
Reminded of the split focus when I noticed the reflective model of triadic supervision. And so was that born out of that?
Back in 2003, I decided to create a model of triadic supervision. I borrowed the concepts and ideas of Tom Anderson, who did clinical work with couples and families starting back in the 80s. I had gone through a training with him. And so when I thought of how to integrate reflecting process into a triadic supervision model, I did frame it as what I just referred to as a split focus, where I have supervision take place in a 90-minute time frame. And that was my choice. So I know others have used the reflective model in a 60-minute format. I personally find that to be too rushed. I know the benefit of doing triadic supervision can be to save time, because instead of taking 2 hours with two people, you could potentially do split focus and do it in 60 minutes. I myself do it in 90 minutes and split that time relatively half and half.
With that split time then, can you share what's happening in the different roles that all of the players have?
Sure. So let me walk you through what happens in the reflective model. I meet with the two supervisees and I first introduce them to the model and the process. And I mention to them that for this reflective model of triadic supervision to work best, they have to have some degree of trust within themselves as a pair. So I do encourage pairs to have some meetings with each other prior to the first supervision meeting. I want them to have some understanding of who they are as people and what they need out of each other to create a safe, trusting environment. Once they've had that conversation, I give the instruction that when we meet, they will alternate week to week on who starts out that triadic supervision meeting. So let's say that they've made that agreement already made, and supervisor one will come in the case, and I then will have a bounded conversation. And what I mean by bounded is I will be looking only at the supervisee that is presenting the case to be discussed. And so the focus of the reflective model is that there are inner and outer dialogues. And so I start out creating this context where I'm having an outer dialogue with supervisee one who's presenting the case. The role of supervisee two is to be sitting off to the side, observing and listening to the conversation that I'm having with supervisee one. So supervisee one might talk about their case, and I will ask them, what is it that you're hoping to get out of our supervision meeting? So I give them control to direct what it is that they want from not just me, but also from their observing peer. And so we will watch and talk about a tape in what I might call traditional supervisory conversations about watching a tape or talking about a case, stopping the supervisee talking about their case or the clip. I might ask reflective-oriented question about what might be going on with you in this particular moment. This is where I think the reflective model is atheoretical and has the potential for our supervisee to infuse their preferred model into the reflective model of triadic supervision. That definitely informs what questions might be asked. So this will take place for about, like I said, about 20 minutes. And then I'll tell supervisee that we're going to go into a pause mode. And then I'll ask them to sit back and literally move their chair away. And I then will turn my chair looking at supervisee two. So now I'm having an outer dialogue with supervisee two who has been listening for the last 20 minutes and observing. And now supervisee one is not part of the conversation. Their job is observing and reflecting on the conversations they're listening, myself, and now supervisee two that we're going to be involved with. And now I'll ask supervisee two something like, so you've had a chance to watch, supervisee one and I talk about their case or watch their tape. What thoughts or ideas of what you heard or have seen stand out for you that you wish to speak to? And I ask those questions broadly because I want to give them space to speak to maybe aspects of what they heard in our conversation, my conversation with supervisee one that stood out for them. I want to give them space to speak to maybe it's something about the case that was discussed or a tape that was shown, a videotape, if maybe something occurred in their clinical session that they want to speak to. I want to give them full space to move with whatever stood out for them. I can obviously have influence on that conversation. I like to start broad and empower the supervisee two to speak to whatever stands out for them. Sometimes they even take it to their own clinical work. Boy, when I was watching you talk to supervisee one about their case, I couldn't help but think about my work with my client that's in a similar situation. So I want those types of linkages to be made. But if I want to ask a more directed question, I can ask, so what were your thoughts about when supervisee one used silence? What were your thoughts on how effective or not effective that may have been in terms of how that landed with the client? What were your thoughts on that? We'll have a conversation such as that for about 10 minutes, is that we don't want to overload supervisee one that's presenting the case and the tape with too much information. And I'll turn back now to supervisee one and I'll say, so you've had a chance to listen and observe myself and your peer talk about our conversation and the case that you presented. What stands out for you in terms of what you just heard over the last 10 minutes? What are your one or two takeaways that you'd like to see yourself move forward in the week ahead with your work with your client or other cases? And so now we'll have a chance to talk about maybe follow-up curiosities or wonderings that they might have about what stood out for them I, again, give great freedom for them to go wherever they want to go and what the meaning that they're making. But I also have, obviously, supervisory power and responsibility that if I want to hone in on particular areas of feedback or the conversation that I want them to hold on to, I will add that after they've had a chance to speak to me about what stands out for them. So I never want to close them off from taking away what stands out for them and saying, this is what you must take away. I want to open up the table and open up the space for them to speak to what stands out for them. And then my comment is truly more additive than dictating that my feedback stands out as more important. I hear weekly that it was so nice to be given that space to just listen to you and my peer talk about my session. I'll hear initially that it's weird that you're talking about me and you're not looking at me, but once they get used to that pattern, they love being in that space where they're in their own mind, taking in my conversation with the other supervisee, and they're then able to go deeper in their own reflections, and they make meaning and in some ways self-supervise themselves in that space. So they love the ability to be freed from that social obligation of looking at their supervisor and feeling the need to respond. They also like that they're not just hearing from me as supervisor, they get to hear from their peer. That person that ends up entering into that 10-minute conversation with me to talk about the session we've just watched, they'll speak to, I feel like my ideas about what's happening clinically with my peer are valued. I realize that I've got comments that are just as beneficial as you as this advanced supervisor.
We've talked about the advantages. Have you experienced any disadvantages to using this model?
What I found out is that whomever goes first tends to get more time. What I do is every other week, they rotate who goes first. So over the length of my contractual supervision, they get equal time. If a personalization comes up that I recognize, or if they recognize, I do have to give space to, is this a topic or a conversation that you're willing to go further on in the presence of your peer? And there are times where the relationship is strong enough between supervisees that they'll say this is fine. Or other times it's like, I think this is a topic I'd rather just talk one-on-one. You might have to shift from Triadic to one-on-one given what the topic might be.
Well, I wanted to thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you sharing your experience related to the reflective model of triadic supervision, David. It's been nice talking and seeing you again, actually.
Yes, well, appreciate you giving me the time, and I hope that folks find this useful.
Many of you know that the BBS now allows triadic supervision to count as individual supervision. And then, Carol, you had wanted to share something.
Well, the Board of Behavioral Sciences does approve it. The Board of Psychology does not. So please keep that distinction.
So now if you could take some time to discuss if you have done triadic and what it has looked like for you, and similarities and differences you've seen between your work and what Dr. Kleist has presented. And if you haven't done triadic, talk about what it would look like to implement this sort of supervision in your setting and some challenges that you might encounter. Dr. DiAnne Borders is a professor at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. She is editor of Clinical Supervisor. And today we're going to focus on the model that you developed in 1991, structured peer supervision.
I would say the most important thing around any model is to think about why you're doing group with this group of people. So what is it that your goals are? What is it that they need? And then that should lead you to what your structure would be and your choice of which model. Some models are more prescriptive than others. How much leadership does this group need? What is the level of their current skill? So those drive not only the model that you choose, but then how you implement that model.
Can you speak about how your model tends to that intention?
The model was created when I was working with beginning counselors. It grew out of what I observed in the group, which was they needed a lot of focus on skills. They needed a focus on getting out of their own heads as beginning counselors. They were very caught up in the noise in their head and what do I say next? not giving very much attention to the client, and so they were missing a lot of information, and they didn't know how to give feedback. They didn't even know what to focus on. Like, what do I give feedback about? They just didn't know how to do this. And sometimes is that they were very nice to each other. I'll pat you on the back and then you pat me on the back. So you get comments like, well, I thought you did a great job. I can't think of anything else I could have done with that client. Supportive, maybe, but not very helpful. So a real big focus for me in creating the model was, how do I teach these people how to give feedback? What even to focus on to give their feedback? And how can I get them past being afraid they'll hurt each other's feelings and give feedback in a way that they can be heard? That's where the roles came in, and a way for people to speak sort of outside of themselves. So it's not me talking to you, my dear friend in the group. I'm not criticizing you, but from this role, here's what I observed. My goals for that model were to help them learn how to give feedback, make sure everybody presented, so there weren't wallflowers that I had to continuously call on because they were shy, they were afraid they would say the wrong thing, afraid they would hurt somebody's feelings. And so those were my primary goals. And so you'll see, if you read very much about the model, and maybe just did you hear me talk about it, you'll recognize some pretty thorough Gestalt training I had after my master's program. And so a major kind of part of that model is that people in the group take different roles, and then they give the feedback from those roles. So for instance, a very, very important role to have is the client role. So what is your client, as you sit there in the client role, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? What do you wish your counselor would say? What are you hoping to get from your counselor today? Those are the kinds of things that person is sitting there trying to be in those shoes, listening to the non-verbal, to the tones, if it's video, watching the client's body language, how they respond to a particular counselor statement. For instance, it's like, yeah, that particular emotional word was not quite right, but so how are you feeling in that moment? So at least one person takes the client role, sometimes two people. I've even run a group where I asked everybody to take the client role because I thought the counselor was so missing what was happening that I wanted multiple voices in the room. And the power of that role to me is that it was so much easier for them to say, well, as the client, I'm feeling. I know you didn't mean for me to feel this way, all right? So they could kind of have some distance from their feedback. So they could give pretty straightforward feedback. As a client, I'm feeling like you didn't really hear what I was saying, or you're not paying attention to the fact that I keep coming back to this one thing, and you seem to want to talk about something different. That as a client, that's what I'm feeling. They would keep saying that. Now that's just me as the client, which helped them distance from, this is my friend in my classroom, and this is my friend maybe outside of the program. Yeah. So that to me is one of the more powerful roles for those kinds of reasons. It also trains counselors while they're working with the client to actually ask themselves those questions. What does my client seem to want from me? What's the main message here that I'm getting from a client? So they can have those kind of checklist questions in their head. So that's the main role, the first role. And if you were, that could be your goal. When you start with why are you doing group supervision, or what your goal, it could be that you really are trying to help people in today's group or over a series of groups really understand how to get in the client's experience. Yeah. And beginning counselors just can't do that. They are so like, what am I going to say next? Mm-hmm. Did I just say the wrong thing? Oh my God, my supervisor is going to jump on me because of that. So getting out of their head can have an impact on multiple levels.
You had mentioned the client role. Are there other roles in the model?
Yes, this facilitator or the person who's presenting can choose the roles. that they feel are most pertinent. So the counselor role can be another one. What is it like to sit with this client who continues to say everything's right, everything's okay, but you can tell that it's not? What's it like to sit with a client who's clearly in emotional dysregulation? How's that impacting you as the counselor when you're sitting there? How are you trying to manage that for yourself? So the counselor role can be another one. Then another role could be a person in that client's life, a family member. What did this person have to say? Because there's probably a gem of truth there somewhere, but probably you're seeing a different explanation for it. But yet that gives you a broader perspective. Mm-hmm. If client is actually a family unit or a couple, then you've got people in the room that you can also, those can be roles that you would use also. There's some more academic roles, although I don't know if the roles is quite the right word. And so how would Rogers, how would Beck describe this client? So that helps them apply and practice what they've learned. A favorite of mine, but a little more advanced, is a metaphor. So what's a metaphor for the relationship? What's a metaphor for the client, for the counselor, for this process that you're feeling in the room? Folks create sometimes because the situation lends itself to it. And again, multiple people have a role because that gives multiple perspectives, which is teaching our students to grow in their cognitive complexity, to see there's not one right answer. So if there's multiple theoretical orientations in the room, one of them's not right. Mm-hmm. One may be more appropriate to apply, but they all lend some information. Mm-hmm. If there's multiple clients, that's just giving you some different perspectives. Multiple metaphors, they may be focused on different parts of the process. So I think that gives you an overview of the more common roles that I proposed and that I've seen people use.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear that there's so much flexibility in the roles that can be used, but I'm also reminded of what you have said as far as it really goes back to the intention of group supervision, and that will inform the roles that could be taken. I was wondering if you could walk through the steps, because if I remember right, there's sort of an order of procedures.
They are not unique, I think, to group supervision, that the person presenting talks about their client, talks about the situation, and identifies what they would like feedback on. And the supervisor may need to step in at that point and help them clarify what feedback they want. What can I do different is not enough. It's not a good request. We need something a little more specific for people in the group to know what to look for. Then roles are assigned. Roles are volunteered for. It depends on your group. It's been fascinating to me that often the supervisor starts assigning the groups, but within a short period of time, the counselor who's presenting will say, and I really want so-and-so to play the client role because or I really want so-and-so to do that theoretical orientation because I don't know that very well, but I think that would really be helpful. Or I want so-and-so to play the client role because you know me really well. And so once we're clarified around that and people's questions have been answered, then the recording is played. And then the feedback can be orchestrated by the supervisor or by the presenting counselor. The presenting counselor could say, I'd like to hear from the client first. I could like to hear from the counselor first. I'd like to start with a metaphor. The group gets pretty facile with using it and knowing how to adapt it to themselves and what they're looking for. It's suggested, again, my Gestalt training, that people speaking from their roles, especially client and counselor, use the first person, I feel. But it also allows the supervisor to almost do this two-chair kind of thing, to have a dialogue between the presenting counselor and the client. The client's like, I'm feeling that you're ignoring my emotions in the room. You can ask the counselor, were you aware that your client, you can set up kind of a dialogue with them. You could, client, what would you really like to hear from your counselor? Well, I was hoping the counselor would. Mm-hmm. Counselor, What kind of thoughts do you have in kind of response to that? So a supervisor who knows the model well and knows their group well can see opportunities to really kind of deepen the dialogue around that. So that goes on with people responding, reporting out from their roles. And then there's a summary that's really up to the presenting counselor. What are your takeaways? What was most meaningful for around that? What are you taking with you to the next session with this with your client? That's the primary step. Built into that, which might be your next question, are the 2 supervisor roles. And one of those roles is to be the moderator. We have 30 minutes for each person who's presenting today, so I got to watch the time to see that we're staying within that. We're making sure people have roles. We're making sure everybody's participating. Questions have been asked. So sort of following kind of the procedures. The more interesting role is the process commentator. That's when you say to the client who's reported out, I feel like you're holding something back. Or you say to the group, it feels like everybody's being really polite today in their feedback. So you're observing the group process, and that's part of your role and your responsibility also.
I get the impression that once someone is familiar with this model, that there doesn't necessarily need to be a trained supervisor. So it could be a peer group, yeah?
Absolutely. Practitioners often rotate who kind of is in charge and kind of leading. And so peer groups could do that. Or it could be, if I'm presenting today, I sort of decide what roles, who might take those roles and kind of facilitate that. If I'm doing it well, even with beginners, the less I have to say, the better it's going.
Right.
Which is true of most group process,
yes.
right? Yes. If I'm being a good group leader and facilitator, my job is observing and kind of smiling, going, look at that, look what they're doing.
Yes.
Yeah.
I've been thinking as I'm listening to you about how the parallels group
Yes.
that you're talking about group cohesion and building relationship, all of those things. So when we're talking about how we can utilize this model with peers, it is peers amongst clinicians and also peers amongst supervisors. So those in supervisory roles can do this kind of a model as peer supervision.
Exactly. How it translates for those folks when we use this model is you could have client and counselor and supervisor roles. See? And so that, and probably the most focused ones would be the supervisor and the counselor. So here's the counselor I'm working with. Here's what happened today. Here's what I'm struggling with. Processes are the same. The roles just shift as they need to.
Well, thank you, Dr. Borders, for joining us. We so appreciate you sharing your expertise.
You're quite welcome. Thank you for giving me opportunity to talk about my passion today.
Now, if you could take a second to think about your own group experience as a supervisee or supervisor and how it compares to what was described by Dr. Borders. She was bringing up the peer aspect of it that isn't always present, and then some things that maybe are new awarenesses for you. I don't know. Was that all right?
That was good. Okay. Now, one of the critical aspects here in understanding more about triadic and group supervision is the critical nature of structure, of preparation, and of providing feedback. And sometimes these are omitted, and sometimes in fast-paced work settings, there just isn't time for a lot of preparation. But in these particular modalities, it's essential because those are some of the results that have come from the literature and from experience, that supervisees feel like those things may be sacrificed. And also there may be an unevenness if you have different levels of supervisees. So be particularly thoughtful about those and planful, and even discuss them with your triad or your group, in terms of group rules or in terms of structuring the situation.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%, especially after hearing Dr. Kleist and Dr. Borders speak to that. And both of the models that they presented make room for the learning that can be experienced as a supervisee, both as someone who where the session is the focus, even the person who's not presenting still has an opportunity to learn. And so as a supervisor, we want to make sure that we're taking advantage of that time.
Also, another thing you could draw upon from a previous session might be to use video clips during the supervision and to review those with both of the supervisees from the clinical work. Might add greater depth and breadth.
Yep, definitely. As Dr. Borders was discussing, it is possible, if you have the time, of course, to have a peer supervision group where you're working on your own supervision with each other and presenting cases and assigning roles like she was describing, just so that you all can grow as supervisors and it doesn't have to be just for supervisees.
Well, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Carol.